Welcome to the Greener Grass podcast from BlueBird Botanicals. I'm your host, Lex Pelger. I'm very pleased to present today a talk with Dr. Julie Holland. She's certainly one of the most influential leaders in the field and serves as the editor pulling together both the Ecstasy book and the Pot book, collections of essays and research. In between them, she wrote the book Weekends at Bellevue, about being in charge of the psych ward at that famous New York City hospital. Her most recent book, Moody Bitches, is a great breakdown of the biology and biochemistry of being female, and it stands alone as an excellent reference work in its own right. Today, she'll share from her practical experience helping people as a therapist, as well as being a believer in the power of dance and drugs and group experience to help heal us all. With much pleasure, here's Dr. Julie Holland. This show is brought to you by BlueBird Botanicals, to spread education about cannabis and other things on the greener side of life. BlueBird CBD oil comes from farms in southern Colorado and is grown using only water, soil, and sunlight. Go to bluebirdbotanicals.com for more info. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with Dr. Julie Holland, the author of many books, including the memoir Weekends at Bellevue. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So, can you tell me a little bit first about your background and how you came to be an author and a doctor?
So I was born in the middle of the 60s and sort of grew up in the 70s in a suburb where a lot of people were smoking pot or taking acid, or I was watching after-school specials about PCP, and I just got very interested in drugs and the brain and how drugs work and how like a tiny little piece of paper could make somebody's whole perspective sort of flip around. So when I was in middle school, high school, I was learning a lot about drugs and about the brain. I got like a subscription to Psychology Today. I was pretty sure that I wanted to go to college and study the brain. I didn't know for sure that I wanted to be a doctor, but I knew that I wanted to do something with the brain. And, whether that was like be a therapist or a psychiatrist or a neurosurgeon, I didn't know. I just knew I was going to be working, above the ears. But I ended up going to Penn, which had this amazing major called the biological basis of behavior. And it was a combination of like neurobio, biopsych, neuropsych. It was all the things I was really interested in. And I minored, my concentration was in psychopharmacology. So even in college, I was just totally focused on studying the brain and the brain's chemistry and how drugs affect brain chemistry and what is normal behavior, what is abnormal behavior. I was always really attracted to insanity, crazy people, homeless schizophrenics. I work in New York City and I'm walking around the city and I can just immediately spot somebody who has got some sort of chronic mental illness. So they stick out to me like a sore thumb, and I will chat with them or give them money or, find out if they're in treatment. I've always been really drawn to people with chronic persistent mental illness. And I've been drawn to drugs. So it seemed like a pretty good place for me, was medicine and psychiatry. And I got very involved with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, when I was an undergrad. Got very interested in MDMA when I was an undergrad because that was the only new drug in my lifetime. Basically, all the drugs had already been discovered and set in stone. And then when I was in college, I'm studying psychopharm, and all of a sudden there's a new drug. It was very exciting for me. And not only was it a new drug, but it was a drug being used by psychiatrists, with their therapists to make the therapy go deeper. So I was just like, what is this? I got very excited about MDMA. I wrote a huge a term paper for a class while I was at Penn about MDMA, and I spent a lot of time on the phone with Rick Doblin and Lester Grinspoon and George Greer and Dave Nichols and just sort of all the players, learning as much as I can about MDMA. And then, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years later, I ended up editing a book called Ecstasy, the Complete Guide, where I just basically reached out to all those people I had been on the phone with that summer at Penn and assigned them chapters. And the Ecstasy book is a nonprofit book. All the proceeds fund clinical research. So I'm the medical monitor for a bunch of studies using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to look at the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. But I'm also the medical monitor of a study looking to treat post-traumatic stress disorder with cannabis. So that's sort of my other love and interest, is all things cannabis and hemp. And so I edited a book called The Pot Book a few years back, which is also a nonprofit book where all proceeds fund clinical research. So one of the things that I do is try to encourage people to support clinical research with MDMA or with cannabis, because all the money for these studies really comes from private donations. It's not coming from the government. It's not obviously going to come from big pharma.
And so I do want to come back to the cannabis part, but I'm curious about what it was like from your vantage point of being interested in drugs and MDMA coming out to see that mix of an exciting new research drug for researchers as well as a party drug, and what it was like to see both of those things happening.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a line I was walking. I followed the whole story in the mid-'80s. I found out about MDMA in terms of psychotherapy, and then just as I was finding out about it, I was also learning that the government was going to make it illegal because people were using it recreationally. And George Greer, who was a psychiatrist working with MDMA at the time, said something to me that I always sort of remember. And I asked him, how did you feel? You had just found this tool that was so helpful in the practice of psychiatry, and all of a sudden it was taken away from you. And he said, I felt like an artist, and I'd always been working with charcoal, and then I discovered oil paints, but I wasn't allowed to use them because other people were sniffing the oil paints. I thought that was an interesting analogy, just this idea of like, hey, I found this great tool that is helping my patients, and, I want to explore it. And like, no, sorry, you can't, because there are kids in Texas who are like dancing on top of the bars, and, we're going to go ahead and make it illegal. So it was very frustrating for the therapists. And I was sort of intimately involved with that process in the 80s, and being in touch with the people who were going through the trials. And I remember when, Francis Young said that it should be Schedule 3, and then the DEA said, yeah, thanks for your recommendation, but we're going to keep it where it is, and the back and forth. And then there a little bit of a Grinspoon loophole where they were suing again, and then they lost. And during this time, I also was going to raves. I mean, I was a college kid. I was in Philly. There was plenty going on with underground techno music and raves, and in med school too. And then when I was in Philly for undergrad and med school. I went to Penn and Temple. Then I came to New York City for my residency. And that was in the early 90s with like NASA raves and the Tunnel and Frankie Bones. And, I was there. But I do remember, so I was on TV once talking about MDMA, and I was with a bunch of ravers, and I went to the Tunnel like that weekend, and it was great because I could just walk right into the Tunnel. I didn't have to wait in line. Scotto knew me. It was very exciting. I felt like a VIP, but I was in there. I was in a rave at the Tunnel, and some kid came up to me and they're like, hey, didn't I see you on TV? Were you talking about ecstasy? And I was like, yeah, that was me. And then they said to me, like, what are you doing here? It was just like, it was like, you're old. You don't belong here. You're not wearing pigtails. You don't have a pacifier around your neck. Like, why are you here? So that really stuck with me, that like, what am I doing here? So then we decided to do a little survey of the ravers and ask some questions so that I could say, like, I'm here because I'm doing research, just to sort of justify my existence. But, I love to dance just as much as the next person. And I love that. And one of the things I write about and talk about quite a bit is this group mind. When there's a lot of people on the dance floor, and many of them are taking the same drug or having the same sort of experience, and they're bonding, they're all dancing together in unison. It's a little bit like, murmurations in flocks of birds or something. There's a group mind that happens then. And that is a really heady experience. And it's also very therapeutic, feeling connected, feeling part of something. That's therapeutic. We're social primates, and we do not do well when we're isolated. And it's, one of the big problems we're having now with our society is as much as that we think that we're connected, a lot of it is really this sort of pseudo connection, and we are isolated more than ever before, and it's making us miserable. So, I liked being involved with the sort of dance movement. And I'm a huge harm reductionist. I've been interested in harm reduction since college. And when I first moved to New York City, I was giving out clean needles. We were doing like a walkabout. I was quite invested in the harm reduction movement. And I think that's the other reason to sort of keep my foot, in the door of the EDM movement, is that, harm reduction is a really big part of what keeps the dance culture safe. And that's really near and dear to my heart.
As there was this harm reduction going on in the EDM scene, what were the therapists learning about what was good on their side for harm reduction and the risks from this brand new drug?
Well, the big lessons were that you shouldn't get overheated, but you also shouldn't get overhydrated. We all sort of learned a valuable lesson where we were all so worried about hyperthermia and heat stroke and telling people to drink water. And somewhere out there, the message sort of got, perverted. And so people had this idea that if they would drink like a gallon of water, it would prevent heat stroke. And then we had a lot of really tragic deaths, not due to heat stroke, but due to overhydration. People who had just taken 1 tablet or 1.5 tablets, but they drank a gallon of water and they basically sort of drowned. They had very low sodium and they had seizures, and people died from overhydration. So, the big lesson there was that you have to be very specific and, not drink water, but just, drink the water that you're losing through sweating, or replace fluids, or maybe better yet, even to drink Gatorade and not water. So it was all a bit of a learning curve with, the messages to give people in terms of harm reduction. And obviously the big important message that continues even now is about counterfeit drugs and drug substitution, and that you really don't know what you're buying or what you're ingesting. And I was around, first people were calling ecstasy Atom when I first got involved, which was like the mid 80s. And then it went from Atom to ecstasy, and then it went from ecstasy to Molly, and this whole kind of Molly rebranding was very frustrating for me, because I think it really gave people the illusion that, this isn't ecstasy, it's Molly, and that means it's pure. And so you don't have to worry. I think there is something to be said for crystals being harder to, make impure than white powder. But certainly with the tablets that were available back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think there may have been sort of less counterfeit tablets than there ended up being when they were selling powder and crystals. But, the bottom line is you don't know what you're getting, that because it's illegal, it's risky and you don't know what you're purchasing. And this idea that it was called Molly, it's a sort of idea of like a little girl with braids and freckles and the sweet Polly purebred, and like, how could that be bad for you? Something named Molly. So that was just kind of frustrating for me. It was this idea of rebranding. What would make it safer is if, there were sort of government regulations and things were packaged and labeled, and you absolutely knew what you were getting. And this is why I'm very interested in sort of the medical model of MDMA assisted psychotherapy, is because the research subjects know exactly how many milligrams they're getting of MDMA. They know that it's pure MDMA. They're not overheating. They're not dancing for hours on end. They're not overhydrating. And so it brings the medical risks down to something that is acceptable, especially in the face of what you may get therapeutically from it.
And so what it's been like for you to be a medical advisor to these kind of MDMA sessions going on?
Well, I really love being a medical monitor. It's really important to me that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy be made available. And the only way to make it available is to prove that it is safe and effective. So what's been great is this whole process. I was at the first FDA meeting in the early 90s. I don't know if it was like 94 maybe, where Charlie Grobe got permission to give MDMA to human subjects. And I remember how excited I was that FDA had given the green light. And I went back to Mount Sinai and I met with my chairman and I was like, we need to start doing MDMA research here at Mount Sinai. And he was just like, there is no way that is ever happening here, which was really devastating for me. I wanted to be involved in MDMA research. But, Charlie sort of paved the way and got things started, and then Michael Mithofer took over, and, I became involved where, as a medical monitor, it's sort of my job to review the protocols, make sure they're safe, review the exclusion criteria, the inclusion criteria, make sure that the people that we're running are safe and that we can get good solid data from the studies. If anything comes up, any sort of side effects or any issues like that, Michael Mithofer and I get on the phone and we sort of hash out what it is and what it means and what we have to do about it and how it needs to be reported. So, and also I finally got my name on a publication. That made me pretty happy too. So, I'm thrilled to be a player, on this very large team of people who are trying to make MDMA into a medicine. And the news this past year about MDMA being placed into, sort of a fast track for FDA drug development, which is a breakthrough therapy designation. It got designated as a breakthrough therapy, which just means it's a little quicker and easier to get it approved. So that was a really big deal. And now, we're gearing up to do multi-center phase 3 MDMA assisted psychotherapy studies all over the country, including in New York City. And I'll be one of the medical monitors on those studies. And I'm just so thankful and full of gratitude and appreciation that I get to be involved in this work, because it's super important work. We all know that, it's not just the veterans who are really struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, although most of our research subjects for these studies are veterans, which I think is great. I used to work at the VA in the Bronx, and I love those guys. I felt very at home at the VA hospital, and I'm really pleased that for the MDMA studies and the cannabis studies, we primarily are treating veterans. And, it's nearly one veteran an hour is committing suicide. But when you broaden that beyond veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, there are lots and lots of people who are traumatized by war, and they're refugees, or they're people who have been sold into slavery or the sex trade, or they've been psychologically abused, physically abused, sexually abused as children. It's a lot of people out there with PTSD. I mean, I would even venture to say that just now in our culture, with the very scary news every day, a lot of us are traumatized and really need healing. So, I'm proud to be working toward making MDMA assisted psychotherapy available to anyone who's got a history of trauma and needs to process that trauma.
With the exclusion criteria that you came up with, what are the most important things that you're paying attention to that you think people should be very cautious or shouldn't be taking this drug?
Well, I think with MDMA, the main caution is that you have no idea what you're taking. And because of that, sort of everybody is at risk. But, within the medical model of who you take as research subjects or not, the main thing that we're sort of shying away from, although I don't necessarily think that we have to, but we are for starters, is people with a history of psychosis or with bipolar disorder or history of mania, or first-degree relatives who've got major psychiatric issues involving mania or psychosis. Also, we're pretty careful about people who have untreated high blood pressure, uncontrolled high blood pressure, any history of strokes or heart attacks. Just for now, for research purposes, I think it's really better to leave those people out of the studies. And, we're even doing that with the cannabis studies, where we're really trying not to take people who've got active, unstable cardiac issues or cerebrovascular issues. So people who have a history of strokes or TIAs, transient ischemic attacks, things like that. People have a history of seizures. And it's not necessarily that these people can't ever undergo MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. It's just that when you're doing research, you don't want any bad things to happen. So you're really super careful about who you let into the research protocol.
And so now to switch gears a little bit from MDMA then to your second book, what did you learn at Bellevue about people and drugs? And, to see this wild place and all the, wild stories that came through the door. It's a great book, by the way, for everyone out there listening. If you want to see what it'd be like to work at the Bellevue ER, it's a great look at it.
So, with Weekends at Bellevue, first of all, it was so easy and fun to write. I mean, I ran the Psych ER every Saturday night and Sunday night. And so Monday morning I would come home and just write up a few things that had happened, a few patients I saw, or, what they said or how they smelled or what they were wearing. Just like a few key things so I could help remember conversations and things that went on. And, one of the chapters in Weekends at Bellevue that I love is actually about a guy who was this big kind of bruising, hulking, tattooed, meaty thug of a guy. And when he used to come in, he was often really scary and very agitated. And it would take like huge amounts of sedatives to sort of calm him down and get him in a position where we could talk to him. And this was a guy who enjoyed PCP use and often came to the Psych ER high on PCP, having brought in by ambulance or the police. But this one time he came in and he wasn't agitated and he wasn't scary and he wasn't high on PCP. And his pupils were dilated and he had a silly little grin plastered on his face. And I met him at the door and was just like, what did you get yourself into? And he said, I'm high on ecstasy. And I was like, good. Like, you and me are going to talk. And, you don't typically do psychotherapy in the Psych ER at Bellevue. It's just kind of triage and like, what do you need? Are you off your meds? You need to be admitted to get on your meds. Are you just like crashing from coke and need to stay here for a couple of days and then you can go? And like, you don't really do a lot of hand holding and touching, no touchy feely psychotherapy stuff. But this guy was ripe for therapy, and I took him in a room and we got down to it. And, I asked him like point blank about his history of childhood abuse and sexual abuse, because anybody who's coming in high on PCP every weekend, I guarantee you, they were not treated as they should have been in their childhood. And so we just sort of started from there. I had a pretty intense therapy session with him, and it really meant a lot to me to have. It was just a complete sort of accident that he came in that way, but it really got me thinking about that there could be a place in a Psych ER for things like ketamine treatment or MDMA assisted psychotherapy, once you've sort of screened and made sure they're not on other drugs or things like that. So, but anyway, really what I saw the most of at Bellevue, honestly, was people crashing from crack. That they'd been on a run of like 2 or 3 days of crack or meth, and then they're totally crashing and suicidal and miserable and out of money, and they would come in and we would keep them for a few days and they would go out again. And we also saw a lot of alcoholics. So like, for me, the most sort of devastating things that I was seeing at the Bellevue Psych ER really had to do with alcohol and cocaine more than any other drug. Every once in a blue moon, I saw somebody, I once had a guy who was brought in from the Chelsea neighborhood, naked and giving away all his belongings. And when he came into the Psych ER, his pupils were a bit dilated. And he was talking a lot, about just like giving away all your belongings and being here now and like how everything is connected. And, but his pupils were dilated. And then he said something about mirrors or sacred mirrors. And I was like, wait a minute. And, talked to him a little bit more. And I realized that he had come from the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, which is Alex Gray and Allison Gray's, gallery in Chelsea. And he had taken mushrooms, that day before he went to the chapel. So he was having not a manic episode, but like a sort of psychedelic epiphany and a real spiritual epiphany. And some people may say like, a Kundalini explosion or something like that. But this was not a guy who had a long history of psychiatric illness and was having a manic episode. So, I was pretty excited to realize, that he was just like tripping at Cosm and needed a place to crash, basically, and sort of a soft place to land. I mean, look, I imagine that if you're coming down from a pretty heavy trip, landing at the Bellevue Psychiatric Emergency Room is going to be a little tricky. And, you've given away your wallet and your phone and your watch, and you're like naked on a stretcher in hospital pajamas. it's a lot to sort of recover from. And that, I was really glad that I could sort of help him with his reentry and his integration and get somebody who knows him to pick him up and bring him clothes. And like for years afterwards, he stayed in touch with me and kind of emailed me and thanked me and like sent me a little bracelet or something. Just, I was happy to be in the right place at the right time. But, it is interesting when people are in the middle of a manic episode, they do look a lot like people who are tripping. I have definitely had people in manic episodes whose pupils are dilated, but more importantly than that, their sort of perspective is dilated. They have this sense that everything is connected and we are all one and, I'm part of the universe. Like there's a lot of talk of like how everything is connected and everything makes sense, in somebody who's having a manic episode. And those are similar ideas and thoughts and feelings that people get, from MDMA, from ayahuasca, from psilocybin, sometimes even just from cannabis and a walk in nature. So I'm working on a book right now that is really about this sense of connection that people who are tripping have, this idea that everything is connected, that you are part of the universe and that there is sort of like a lattice work of energy that everyone is jacked into. The sense of oneness. The psychedelic researchers will talk about oceanic boundlessness, which is this idea that you're sort of in the soup, you're part of the soup, and that where you end, the soup begins, and it's not really clear where you end or whether you are the entire soup. This idea of oneness, versus a sort of a singular sense of self or feeling isolated. So, and a lot of that to me is sort of oxytocin mediated, the sense of connection, feeling connected with somebody, whether it's, lovers in the sort of post-orgasmic cuddling phase, or whether it is a mother and child who are nursing and bonding that way, or whether you're peaking on psychedelics. Those are all high oxytocin states. And oxytocin has a lot to do with bonding and trust. And also the therapeutic alliance. With MDMA, you have very high levels of oxytocin. And one of the things that predicts good outcome for psychotherapy is having an enhanced therapeutic alliance, a sense of being on the same team as your therapist. And that is also sort of oxytocin mediated, this therapeutic alliance. And as I said, with MDMA, you get very high levels of oxytocin. So the book I'm working on now, really, it kind of comes down to oxytocin, like 9 times out of 10 when I start talking about bonding and trust and tribes and altruism, and parenting and tripping. It all kind of comes back to oxytocin for me. I mean, again, because I'm very biologically oriented. I mean, you can blame Penn, the biological basis of behavior. That was my major. That was my bias. So I always kind of keep coming back to the biology. Somebody kind of dissed Moody Bitches on Twitter the other day saying like, I understand now that all my emotions are totally about biochemistry and there's nothing spiritual going on. And it was like, in Portuguese, by the way. And at first I actually kind of liked it and retweeted it, but then when I read the translation, I realized that maybe they were kind of giving me shit for my bias. But I definitely do have a real biological bent in how I think about things. And, one of the great things about being married to my husband, Jeremy Wolf, is that he doesn't think biologically at all. He really thinks psychologically and spiritually and much more holistically. And so I'm always sort of getting the part that's missing when I talk to my husband, Jeremy. So maybe you'll talk to him sometime. He writes about cannabis and spirituality quite a bit.
Yeah.
The other end of things, the cultural end of drugs that isn't so biological.
And as I always tell people, I think that his essay, Thoughts on Pot, spelled like it rhymes with pot, in your pot book is just one of the best essays on cannabis in general that I've ever read. And it's worth getting the book just for that essay, which actually the essay is online for free as well, somewhere.
Is it?
Yeah, I looked it up somewhere. Yeah, it's out there.
Yeah, I think on thepotbook.com, there's quite a few chapters. It's certainly possible Jeremy's is one of them. He also wrote a chapter for the Cannabis and Spirituality book that was edited by Stephen Gray. So and I wrote the foreword for that book, and one of the things I sort of talked about was like how important it is, even though I'm not doing it, how other people should make sure to write and talk about the spiritual aspect of cannabis. It's not just about the fact that it's an anti-inflammatory medicine or, that it can calm you or help you focus, but there really is a spiritual component that it does help you feel this sense of connection, whether it's with nature or just with yourself or with a partner. There is, I think, for a lot of people, cannabis, especially I think out in nature, where it really makes you feel sort of connected, and like you're somewhere magical. You know, one of the things I love about cannabis is this idea that everything old is new again, that you look at things with fresh eyes, and things that you've seen a million times before, just sort of glanced over, they become more salient, more interesting. They capture your attention more. Cannabis does that, but there's another drug I was reading about how when you take psilocybin or LSD, two things happen. One is that the everyday mundane becomes fascinating, and that you treat it as if it's a novel thing that you need to pay attention to. But also, novelty is treated as mundane. So when you're tripping, you know, like you may look at the street lights and like they're so beautiful, the red and the yellow and the green, like it's so gorgeous. But a car going by, which you should say like, oh, be careful, this is novelty, I need to be careful. That just becomes like yet another thing to process. It doesn't have the weight that it should, which is why it's somewhat dangerous crossing the street when you're tripping, because when you're not tripping, your brain will give proper weight to a speeding car versus the stoplight. But when you're tripping, everything is sort of magical and interesting, and you sort of flip the salience of what's important, what you should be paying attention to, and what you shouldn't. But who's to say what you should be paying attention to?
Well, I think Anne Shulgin has it. Anne Shulgin's example always made me happy, because she said, you know, if you have a tiger running at you and you're on psilocybin, you really shouldn't be spending your time admiring how beautiful and yellow that tiger's fangs are.
Right. Like, wow, look at those pretty stripes. So, I mean, look, that is a reason, you know, why people talk about set and setting and being somewhere safe, where you don't have to worry about those things, so that you can just close your eyes and go inward, and you know that you're physically safe. And that's part of the beauty of the medical model, is that you're in a really safe setting.
And that actually takes me back to a question I want to answer earlier from Bellevue, is someone coming in that's that disoriented and having either a manic state or a drug experience. For people out there who have their friends and have this happen to them, what advice would you give as some of the most important first things to help get someone down and safe so it doesn't have to go to an ER?
Right. I mean, the first thing I would say is, like, as much as I love Bellevue and they do very good work there, that's sort of your last choice. So one of the things that I learned when researching this is that if you have somebody who's in an altered state, as opposed to putting them in a quiet, dark room, which is what we used to do back in the 70s and 80s. Now the idea is that you put them in a room that has some lighting, with sort of subdued lighting and not too much sound. But a really dark, quiet room is not great, because you end up sort of projecting visions onto the darkness. So you're better off being able to see what's around you. But, you know, ideally it is away from other people. It's in a situation where you can sort of control who comes in or out. And you just basically want to make a space for somebody. You want, like, a holding area where they can go through their experience without worrying about, getting hurt or hurting anybody else or being too loud. Sometimes people need to work through very difficult material that they're processing, and, you know, difficult doesn't mean dangerous or even traumatic. I mean, sometimes people need to work through difficult things. You know, one thing that happens a lot with MDMA or with psychedelics is that unconscious material comes up and needs to be processed. People can remember things that happened in their childhood that they had forgotten about. You may remember that somebody touched you inappropriately or, you know, hurt you in some way. And when these memories come up, they're terrifying, they're disorienting, and it's hard to process them. So in a room with somebody who's sitting with you, maybe holding your hand or just creating space for you and allowing you to go through what you need to go through, that is going to be more sort of therapeutic. I mean, the problem with taking somebody to an ER is that they're not going to be allowed to totally process what's going on. You know, when the doctors are in charge, they're going to either want to sedate you, or sometimes they restrain you if they think that you're being really agitated. And that in and of itself can be really traumatic. You know, one of the things, I was at a DPA conference recently, and I had a huge epiphany there. And I actually started crying when I was talking about it, which is always mortifying for me. But if you know me, you will know that I am a crier. And sometimes when I'm speaking in front of a group and I come across something that feels very true for me, I get really choked up. And like it used to be that whenever I talked about the veterans committing suicide 1 an hour, I could barely, like 23, 24 guys killing themselves every day. Like I could barely get that out without crying. But I've said it so many times now that I can. But at DPA, I thought for the first time deeply about this idea of people being traumatized by their doctors, by their therapists, by the emergency room staff, that sometimes you go and ask for help, and in the process, you are traumatized. For instance, you are somebody who has got sort of a problematic relationship with drugs, and you go to a psychiatrist, and they say to you, once you quit the drugs, I can treat you. Which is really just like somebody slamming a door in your face. Or just being treated badly by doctors. I mean, I totally wrote in Weekends at Bellevue about times where I was kind of like sadistic and like a real asshole with some of my patients. And how, under what circumstances that can happen. But this idea, like we talked about a therapeutic alliance before, like when you feel trusting of your doctor and you're on the same team and you know that doctor's trying to help you, or that clinician, that therapist, that therapeutic alliance is very healing. But the opposite of that is when you have some sort of medical trauma or psychological trauma, when the person who's supposed to be helping you is doing a really crappy job of helping you. And the thing I talked about at DPA, I don't know if you remember back when the water protectors, Standing Rock, I saw on Facebook one day this video. It really moved me. It was a person dressed up in full Native American regalia and costume, and another person dressed up in full 1800s military costume. And the person who was representing the American military apologized to the Native American. And they said, we took your land, we raped your women, we gave you smallpox, we stole your culture, just all these things, like we did these horrible things to you. And the Native American representative was saying, he was sort of mirroring back, like, you took our land, you raped our women, like, yes, you did these things. And then the person was apologizing. I'm sorry that we did all these things. And the Native American was saying, I accept your apology. And when I thought about that, at DPA, I sort of wanted somebody, and I was saying not me because I'm going to cry, but like I want some representative of the medical community and some representative of the drug using community to have that sort of staging, that ceremony, a ceremony of apology. Like, we as clinicians have let you down. We didn't help you. We didn't take you where you were. We said you had to follow our rules. We failed you. And we hurt you, and we traumatized you in this process. I really think that there's something there, this idea, and it's kind of getting back to connection, and what heals people. And having a real disconnect with a healer is traumatic and the opposite of healing. And I'm afraid that sometimes that's what happens, that doctors are sort of dismissive of quote, junkies, end quote. And they don't treat them nicely.
And what's it like for you as you move through the wider psychiatric community, where they're often pretty backwards, from my view, on psychedelic drugs, opiate drugs in general, and it's oftentimes it seems like a paucity of knowledge and sympathy for this kind of stuff.
Right. Well, I think first of all, people are afraid of things they don't understand. And they're afraid of situations where they are going to lose control, where they don't have control. And certainly doctors like to control things. For instance, if you are pregnant and about to give birth and you go into a hospital, you will have a much different experience than if you stay home with a midwife. And that the doctors like to intervene. They like to hook you up to monitors. They like to give you medicines. They like to sort of get in the mix and control things. And certainly something like childbirth, which has to go on its own, it's nature, it's earth time and mother nature time. It's not medical time. So, I know I'm kind of sidetracking here, but it's just, in psychiatry and in any field of medicine, I think the doctors, when they don't know what they're dealing with, they really shut down from it. And we're not taught in medical school how psilocybin works, how ayahuasca works, how ketamine works, how cannabis works. We're just not taught about these things. And we're certainly never, ever taught that these drugs may actually be used like medicines and that they may be therapeutic. So I spend a lot of my time educating people, doctors, patients, anybody who will listen about this idea that, these may be Schedule 1 drugs that are sort of incorrectly placed in Schedule 1, but they really do have the potential to help people and to heal people. There's like so many different things that cannabis can do, but the thing that we never really talk about is also it can make you kind of lighthearted. It can make you happy and relaxed, and interested in boring things. And, it's sort of like entertainment insurance. Like if you go to a movie that's sort of not a great movie, but you have a little cannabis on board, you might think it's a pretty good movie, some of these things are therapeutic in and of itself. This idea that we separate, recreational from therapeutic, which we do all the time, right? Oh, that's recreational marijuana. That's not therapeutic. Recreation is therapeutic. I will say as a psychiatrist that anything you can do that helps you relax and feel good, is good for you and good for your body. And it is anti-inflammatory. Being relaxed or meditating or going for a walk in the woods, like these things are anti-inflammatory, which means not just that you're covering up symptoms of the disease, but you're actually getting to the root causes of the disease. And it may turn out that there's an anti-inflammatory component to some of these psychedelic treatments also. I mean, certainly Dave Nichols' son, Chuck Nichols, is looking quite a bit at the sort of anti-inflammatory effects of LSD and other 5-HT2A agonists. So I don't think we've got the full story yet.
And the importance of inflammation. I have a friend who's in med school right now, and he says it seems like that seems to be the thing they're pounding in med school the most, is got to keep inflammation down, but there's no good medicines to do that, and it turns out that cannabis is one of the best anti-inflammation things we have. Right.
Absolutely true. When I was in med school in the late 80s, early 90s, and there was nothing about cannabis, no such thing as the endocannabinoid system, and very little really about inflammation. But now, this is something I really learned about when I was researching Moody Bitches. There's a whole chapter in Moody Bitches on inflammation. The chapter is called Inflammation, the Key to Everything, because it is a really big deal. It's so fundamental. And yes, cannabis is a huge anti-inflammatory medicinal herb, and CBD is anti-inflammatory. If, you prefer to not be altered with your medicine intake, then that's certainly an option. I've been talking to my patients in my private psychiatric practice more and more about CBD, for calm, for focus, for ADHD symptoms. I have patients who have got like a little bit of arthritis and bone pain, or a little bit of eczema and psoriasis, and they're anxious and they have focusing issues. And I'm thinking like, CBD can help that. Like you've got a lot of reasons to be taking CBD, or just adding CBD onto what else you're doing. And, I have a patient who's taking high doses of opiates because she has a lot of pain, and nobody wants her to do that. She doesn't want it. None of her doctors want it. But now that she is also taking CBD products from BlueBird Botanicals, as a matter of fact, she is able to chip away at her opiate intake. And I've seen this over and over, and I've been hearing about it. When I edited the pot book, I kept hearing about doctors who were seeing that when patients were on like a solid dose of medicinal cannabis, they were drinking less alcohol. They were taking fewer pain meds. They were getting their other sort of addictive compulsive behaviors into check. So the very worst case scenario, like the worst thing you could say about this is like, oh, well, they're substituting one drug for another. That's the worst thing you could say. But still, you're substituting a drug that doesn't stop breathing and has anti-inflammatory effects. So it's a much better substitution. And I would make the case that it's obviously much more than just swapping out one drug for another. I really feel like medicinal cannabis is one of the main keys to our nation's opioid epidemic. You're talking about a medicine that can treat the kind of pain that opiates don't treat very well, like paresthesias, pins and needles, neuropathy, this kind of thing. Like opiates don't work very well for that. Cannabis does work much better, but also because it's an anti-inflammatory medicine, you're getting to the root cause of the symptoms. Opiates don't fix anything. They just kind of cover it up. You can make a case that cannabis does a better job getting to the root of the problem than opiates do, for sure.
And you live in one of the worst states in the nation in terms of the medical marijuana program. Has it been getting any better since we talked before?
Well, I mean, one really nice thing is a couple weeks ago, I was able to sign up a patient of mine who I've been treating since 9/11, who's got horrible post-traumatic stress disorder and ADD. I was able to finally sign him up as a PTSD patient for the New York program. So that made me pretty happy. It was the first time I got to click that box. But the New York program is terrible. I'm sorry. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's terrible. First of all, there's no flower in the medical program. It's all like capsules and tinctures and cartridges. There's no pot. There's no actual cannabis flower in the program. And so that's pretty upsetting. And there's not much product, and the prices aren't great. I have to admit, I have a lot of patients who, even if they get a card for the New York program, they're still importing things from Colorado, California, Washington State, where there's more variety of what they want and the prices are better. So New York has a long way to go. And I'm 62% of the state would like cannabis to be legal. So I think there's a real push now to just make New York a legal state because the medical program is so inadequate. And we'll see what happens. The New York state legislature is very dysfunctional. But it is really frustrating being a doctor in New York as opposed to, California or Colorado or somewhere like that. It's very hard. If you're a doctor who believes in the healing effects of cannabis, it's very frustrating to be practicing in New York State.
On the flip side, it does seem like the New York City itself, at least, is one of the epicenters for ketamine as a treatment. And you've mentioned it a couple times. And so I wanted to get your basic opinion on what you've seen about how helpful ketamine can be.
Well, ketamine's just like a completely other option. We talk a lot about MDMA or psilocybin or ayahuasca, as a way in. But ketamine is also a way in, and it's a completely different neurotransmitter system. It's like a completely different doorway. But you can still get to this altered state where you can kind of pull back and see the big picture. I talk about seeing the macro. If you ever play video games, sometimes you're stuck in a corner and you don't realize it until you look at the macro, and then you realize I've just been going around in circles. You pull back and see the big picture. You can make changes in your path, in your trajectory, where you're going. So I think that ketamine really does allow you to do that. But also there's something more sort of basic and biological about ketamine where it really almost one way to think about it, and this is very crude and basic, but it's almost like restarting your computer, like shutting it down and turning it back on again, where it just seems to clean out some of the gunk that was there. And there are a lot of treatment programs now in New York City that are offering IV ketamine. And I have a colleague who uses my office once a week to do ketamine treatments, and I refer some of my patients to him. I think there is a lot of promise there. If nothing else, sometimes you have people who are really in crisis. Like at Bellevue, you'd have somebody come in and they would be an extremist, suicidal, really wanting to die, hopeless, not seeing any point in going on. And I think in that situation, giving somebody ketamine or MDMA, could be an acute interrupter in turning that suicidality around. And I think actually there just was a paper published about suicidality and ketamine that just came out showing that the numbers really do go way down. So, we don't have things like this in psychiatry. We don't really have a medicine that makes therapy go deeper, go faster, be more efficient. We don't have medicines that immediately get people to be more hopeful and less suicidal. There's really a need for these kinds of medicines in psychiatry. I mean, there's a real need for ketamine and MDMA and psilocybin and ayahuasca and LSD and cannabis in psychiatry. And sure, there's a lot of resistance. These are illegal drugs, and a lot of people don't understand them, and they're scary because anything can happen. But I also, as much as you assume that there's a lot of resistance, I have also had really great conversations with fellow psychiatrists and therapists about these sort of, outside the box treatment modalities and treatment ideas. And I think people are more and more open to it. There's certainly been a lot of media coverage of this thing over the years, more and more. So people are getting used to the idea. And I also think that Michael Pollan is going to really end up helping the movement tremendously. Michael Pollan has a book coming out in May about ayahuasca and psilocybin and LSD, the sort of classic hallucinogens. He does not talk about MDMA or cannabis or ketamine, as far as I know. And, my book will come out a couple years after his, and I will sort of back clean up and cover all these other things that I also think are important. But, when I think about Michael Pollan writing a book, I get very enthusiastic and energized because, I remember when when everybody was talking about grass-fed beef and like grass-fed beef, it was just like everyone was talking about it. And then I also remember everybody was talking about bacteria and, kombucha and cultured foods. Michael Pollan writes a book and a lot of people start talking about these things. So I'm very hopeful that when his book on psychedelics comes out, that will help to sort of break things wide open and more people will be talking about it and accepting the idea that this really is a potential, it is a breakthrough. It deserves breakthrough designation. These are breakthrough treatments. These are sort of game changers. There's a quantum leap changing right now in how we can treat psychiatric illnesses. These medicines really do deserve the designation of breakthrough therapies. They are going to make a tremendous difference to a lot of patients. And it's really an exciting time to be a psychiatrist, to have so many new tools to treat all the malaise that is accumulating. I'll tell you, I've been sort of joking, like Trump is great for business. He's great for my business. So it's a fine time to be a psychiatrist because at least in New York City, I'll tell you, people are, they're anxious, they're fearful, they're despairing, they're in mourning, for what could have been and the direction we could have gone in, and they're in mourning for the planet, for the earth. People are really miserable and anxious. And, it's like if you're not traumatized, you're not paying attention. So I've got, business is booming. But I tell a lot of my patients that, one way to feel better is to pay less attention. And as much as you want to be informed, putting your phone down and going for a walk outside will make you feel better because we're exposed to a lot of really terrible things right now. And it's all really traumatizing.
And so for moving forward, what do you think are some of the biggest roadblocks for medical people in coming to a really sane, reasonable relationship with using these new therapies among your colleagues?
Well, I think the biggest potential roadblock is the government. I think at any time they can step in and just put a halt to the whole thing. Jeff Sessions is somebody that we really need to worry about, and I think you can't underestimate how powerfully the government could step in if they want to at any time and really put an end to things. And, back in the 70s, there was all kinds of psychedelic research going on, and then it all got shut down. And so I think, everybody knows this, and we know we're trying to be very careful. And I think, you can see this reflected in very safety-minded research protocols, and everybody is trying to, cross their T's and dot the I's and be very sort of buttoned up and not make any mistakes. But there is really, I think, a substantial risk at any time that the government can just come in and shut things down. I think we're really lucky so far that hasn't happened. But, this is a real renaissance. There's research going on all over the world, and a lot of exciting things going on in England, and a lot of exciting sort of neuroimaging studies in real time where you can see sort of how the brain blood flow is flowing while people are taking these drugs. It's an exciting time to be a psychiatrist. I get emails all the time from people saying that they want to do what I do, or they want to be involved in psychedelic research. They want to go to grad school. They want to go to med school. And I love getting these emails because it makes me feel like it'll keep going, that whatever was started and whatever I'm continuing and we're continuing, that it will sort of take on a life of its own, and it will be harder to stop as more and more people find out how helpful these drugs can be.
And so before I let you go, can you tell me a little bit more about this upcoming book?
The original working title for the book was called Good Chemistry. And I don't know if it will still be called Good Chemistry when it comes out in 2 or 3 years. But it's this idea that, like, you know, some people, when they hit it off, when they meet each other, they have good chemistry. You know, there's something about two people meeting and they just jibe and they have chemistry. And this idea of, like, people connecting. But I also, like, from the time I was, like, a teenager, people would say to me, like, why are you always in such a good mood? Like, why are you so happy? And I would always say, I just have good chemistry. You know, I mean, there's just, for whatever reason, I don't have a history of depression or panic attacks or things like that. Like, I'm just usually in a pretty good mood. I'm pretty lighthearted and playful. That's just part of what my chemistry is. But I also wanted to talk about good chemistry in terms of, drugs, altering your brain chemistry in ways that are beneficial. You know, getting back to this oxytocin idea, the idea that there are certain drugs that end up enhancing oxytocin levels, that end up enhancing bonding and trust and a therapeutic alliance, and how good that is for your body and for your relationships. So it's a book about oxytocin and sex and drugs. You know, it's all about psychedelics and ketamine, you know, and ayahuasca and psilocybin and cannabis. And it's also a book about what?
What's not to like?
Right, exactly. Right. There's sex, drugs, and, like, oneness. You know, it's all about oneness, togetherness, tribal affiliations, you know, feeling like you're on my team, you're part of my family. This sort of us and them mentality, which is also pretty oxytocin derived. But I also really want to talk about neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, which is this idea of certain drugs allowing brain cells to connect or brain cells to form. There's really interesting research. It's preclinical. It's not in humans. It's in sort of petri dishes, but showing that ayahuasca and psilocybin cause brain cells to connect with other brain cells, or they cause the growth of brain cells. So I really want to talk about neural circuitry and, like, the default mode network, this idea of, like, brain patterns and brain circuitry and neuroplasticity, the way that you can change circuitry. These drugs like MDMA and ayahuasca and psilocybin and LSD and probably ketamine, although ketamine is not oxytocin oriented, which sort of makes it different. But anyway, there's something to be said for these drugs and neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And I really want to talk about that, this idea of, like, making new brain cells and new connections, that's also part of the good chemistry. And I also, one more thing, I want to talk about death. I really want to talk about death and, like, psychedelic hospice and using psychedelic assisted psychotherapy as a way to come to terms with your death or the death of a loved one. I feel like we really have a huge blind spot in American medicine and how we help people die. We don't help people die. You know, we help babies come in, we usher babies in, we've got doulas and midwives and lactation consultants, but we really don't have, like, a death doula or a death consultant or people who help you have a good death. And I think that there is a place in this discussion of how to have a good death that includes things like psilocybin or LSD or ketamine or ayahuasca. You know, some of the studies that they're doing, psilocybin studies, are with people who have a terminal illness, and also MDMA studies with people who have a terminal illness. So I'm very interested in this aspect of psychedelic research also, the sort of helping people have a good death. And, you know, I would say that that's part of being connected. To accept, you know, you have to accept that there's an end game and that you're not going to exist anymore. If you really want to be integrated and fully connected, you have to connect to that thing too, that we're all going to die. You know, that you and everyone you love, not in that order, is going to die. You know, so we do a lot to sort of repress and not think about that and separate ourselves off from that, and that creates a lot of our, you know, anxiety and unease, and we need to sort of integrate that stuff back in.
Could you see that as a path for yourself in the future, psychedelic death center, and helping to make something like that happen?
Well, you know, Catherine McLean is very interested in psychedelic hospice, and I have always said that I will absolutely help her. I would be on the board of directors. I'll help her get the place up and running. You know, I think that such a thing could exist, should exist. I had a patient who had pancreatic cancer and was really sick, and I was advising her on how to ingest her cannabinoids so that she would be less sick. And then she decided that she wanted to do psilocybin therapy to help her sort of come to terms with her death and to help her husband. I guess what I would say in a nutshell is that if I have a patient who is dying and having trouble coming to terms with the fact that they're dying, I would like them to be able to avail themselves of psychedelics or MDMA or ketamine or something to help them make peace with what is happening, and also maybe to give their families some sense of peace about what is happening. And that is the kind of work that's going on. You know, Phil Wolfson in San Francisco is working with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for people in end-stage cancer or terminal illness. And then at NYU, they were giving psilocybin to people with terminal illness. I think this kind of research is really important and deserves to move forward.
Well, Julie, thank you so much for coming onto the show and sharing with us and putting all these books out there, and good luck getting the next one written.
Yeah, that I will need. But I appreciate your good wishes. Couple of years. It'll get done.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, and great talking to you.
All right. Good talking to you too, Lex. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Greener Grass is a BlueBird Botanicals podcast. Their CBD oil supports a healthy body and a strong endocannabinoid system. They've got friendly customer service who can answer any of your questions, and the number is right there at the top of their webpage. But, per the FDA, they won't be able to make any medical claims for these nutritional supplements. That's also the reason you'll hear little about CBD on this show. There's no need for us to add more evidence about CBD when a simple Google search will give you more than you can read in a month of Sundays. So this show covers the cannabis world and more with editorial freedom from BlueBird Botanicals. Thanks for joining the Greener Grass podcast. As always, our audio alchemist is Matt Payne. The Gypsy Jazz theme music comes from Brett Van Donsel. Our beautiful bird sounds are courtesy of Lang Elliott. And I'm your host, Lex Pelger, wishing you a bright green day.